Good afternoon. It's great to have you here today in a wonderful day in the life of the university. My name is Bob Gregerson. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at Florida Gulf Coast University. And on behalf of the college, on behalf of the university, I want to welcome you to today's lecture. This is the inaugural lecture in what we will have an annual series that we're going to be bringing to the public, to the community. And we're really excited about that, funded by the Eric Liebert World Affairs Program Endowment. In a few minutes, we'll be introducing our speaker for today, Dr. Stephen Walt from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. But I need to say a few thank yous to people that made this happen today. First and foremost, I would like to thank the late Dr. Eric and Bernice Liebert for the endowment that makes this event possible. Dr. Liebert was a prominent Chicago area neuropsychiatrist, both as a practitioner and a scholar of the discipline. He was also clinical director of Elgin State Hospital and a fellow of the American Academy of Neurology. But he was also a true Renaissance man with wide-ranging interests that included world affairs and the arts. Hence why we're here today with this event. His wide interests are reflected in the endowments to the Florida Gulf Coast University Foundation in his name to help promote world affairs and to provide scholarship support for students. I'd like to thank the following individuals who really helped make this day possible. Annika Sturdivant, who I saw somewhere. Where are you, Annika? Way in the back. Someone's forcing her to raise her hand. Thank you, Annika. She provided invaluable help with the planning and communications associated with this event. Dolly Farrell, Tony Lee, and Sarah Mayo from University Advancement. They're back there in the back as well. Dolly, special thanks to you for your help in making this event possible. I really appreciate it. Jeff Garner and Arlene Thompson from University Marketing. I don't know if they're here, but thank you. Hutan Shambayati, Associate Professor of Political Science, who spent so much time in the planning and organization. He did an amazing job. He's from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. And the planning committee members who worked with him are Dr. Richard Coughlin, who's also back there in the back, Vanja Petrovic, I didn't see, there she is way in the back, and Dr. Roger Green, chair of the department. Roger, thank you so much. Also thanks to Dr. Wilson Bradshaw, president of Florida Gulf Coast University, Dr. Ron Toll, provost, for all their support, help, and all their work on behalf of FGCU, faculty, students, and staff. We appreciate everything you do. And then finally, thank you to all of you for being here with us today. You're here because you're interested, you're curious, and you want to get the insights of Dr. Walt. So thank you so much, and now I'll ask Dr. Hutan Shambayati to come to the podium for the introduction of our speaker. Hutan? Yep.
Well, first, let me welcome you all here. Thank you for joining us. And I got to say, I mean, Annika's help has been extraordinary. It was not only designing all of our posters and publicity, but also numerous late-night texts and phone calls trying to reassure me that everything was going to be okay. So she gets all the credit for this. This is, I also like to mention that the Lieberts have also endowed a music fellowship here. And I think this year's recipient, Jordan Manalelli, I don't know if she's here or not. I don't see her here, but she is a member, she's a bassoonist with our wind ensemble, which played at the Carnegie Hall in November. And we are very proud of that and of her. Let's see, what else? I should say, I did write a lecture last night, but then I forgot to bring it with me. So I'm going to try to wing it. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Walt. He's a graduate of Stanford University and also of the UC Berkeley, where he received his PhD in 1998. And I should say that he's an alumni of those colleges, and this is also the beginning of the alumni week here or the alumni weekend here at FGCU. So I'd like to welcome all of our alumni here and also our future alumni and our present students, many of whom are here. So getting back to Professor Walt now. He has taught at Princeton University, the University of Chicago, and of course is now the Robert and Rene Belfer Professor of International Relations at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Professor Walt is a former academic dean and the author of many books and articles on and is on the editorial board of the numerous academic journals, including as a contributing editor to the journal Foreign Policy. He has a very varied list of publications, beginning with his book, Origin of Alliances, that is a must-read in international relations, and more practical works. And my favorite is IR Theory for Lovers, a Valentine's Guide, which applies the IR theory to marriages. And I could never figure out whether that marriage is a balance of power or a balance of threat. With that, I want to invite Professor Walt to talk to us today about the US foreign policy. Steve.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm not sure which of these microphones is the one I'm supposed to pay attention to, but can you still hear me? No. Oh, all right, we'll go with this one. And thank all of you for coming, and I want to in particular thank the department that has played host to me really very graciously today. I'm going to talk about U.S. foreign policy, and it hasn't been a big topic thus far in the presidential campaign, not yet anyway. That may be because neither party can claim a great deal of recent success in this area, and I'm going to try to explain why I think that's the case. Specifically, I'm going to try and explain why American foreign policy over the past 20 years or so has been a failure, despite our enormous power and our mostly good intentions. That's especially discouraging given the extraordinary optimism many people felt as the Cold War came to an end. I think our blunders are part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason why things didn't work out as well as many hoped. And it's those mistakes that I'm going to try to explain today. And let me start with a couple of historical comparisons to put this in perspective. Right after World War II, a rather small group of American officials led the creation of the key institutions that still underpin the global order: NATO, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations. They formulated and implemented the strategy of containment. They conceived and implemented the Marshall Plan. They managed crises in several unfamiliar areas. And they did all of this while facing a rival superpower that had great military strength and millions of sympathizers around the world. The record of Truman, Kennan, Marshall, Acheson, and others was not perfect, but on the whole, it was a pretty impressive achievement. Similarly, between 1988 and 1992, the first Bush administration managed the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, the first Gulf War, and the Madrid Mideast Peace Conference. Not a perfect record. They make mistakes, as all leaders do, but in general, it was a positive performance in rather challenging and unexpected circumstances. By contrast, the record of U.S. foreign policy since then is mostly a record of failure, even though the end of the Cold War left the United States in a remarkable position. Even so, we failed to secure Middle East peace despite repeated attempts under 3 administrations. Today, a 2-state solution, the one we claim to be in favor of, is further away than ever. The United States kept thousands of troops in the Persian Gulf after the 1991 Gulf War, which became one of the reasons al-Qaeda attacked us on September 11th. We responded by invading Afghanistan and then Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with September 11th, and then we failed to win a clear victory in either of those wars, despite spending several $1 trillion and thousands of lives. Our failure in Iraq led directly to the emergence of ISIS, and so it plays some role in the events in Paris or in San Bernardino and in several other places. We also failed to build a positive relationship with Russia. 2 years ago, we got blindsided by their forceful response in Ukraine, the relationship now worse than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Our intervention in Libya creates a failed state. Our repeated interventions in Somalia and Yemen have made things worse each time. During this period, North Korea, India, and Pakistan all tested nuclear weapons despite strong American opposition. Over this period, the United States ignored several Iranian overtures to try and improve the relationship, and instead we put enormous pressure on Iran to halt its nuclear program, including repeated threats of military force. The result of this was that Iran went from having 0 nuclear centrifuges operating in the year 2000 to over 19,000 operating a year ago. Now, since then, we've gotten an agreement that caps Iran's capabilities, but we could have had a better deal. At least it's possible we could have had a much better deal if we had tried much earlier. In terms of the Arab Spring, we helped push Mubarak out in Egypt, and then we welcomed the Egyptian military back 2 years later. We declared that Assad must go before we had a strategy for achieving that goal. Today, 250,000 Syrians are dead, and it's hard to see our policy there as a success story. Last but not least, by most measures, the level of freedom in the world is lower now than it was 15 years ago, and while we've been busy doing all of those things, China's power has grown, and it is now challenging the status quo in Asia. Now, that's a one-sided picture. There have been some successes, the Dayton Accords, the creation of the World Trade Organization, a better relationship with India than we had 20 years ago. But on the whole, this is not a record that deserves any prizes. And I would include, by the way, the Nobel Peace Prize that President Obama got back in 2009. What makes this especially surprising is that the United States has a foreign policy establishment that is larger, more extensive, better educated than it was back in 1945. It's staffed with lots of knowledgeable, serious people. We have hundreds of academics and policy analysts outside of government to provide people in government with expert advice. And given all that, you would think we would be doing pretty well. But as I'm going to argue in a little while, it's actually our foreign policy establishment that's part of the problem. All right, so with all that as background, I'm going to start by describing our position in the world, because that, in a weird way, is the taproot of the problem. I'm then going to talk about the different institutions that shape foreign policy in the United States, how we actually do business with the world, and explain why they actually make our foreign policy less effective than it could be. I will then close with an uncharacteristic note of optimism and open this up to questions. So the first thing to recognize is that we are in a remarkably favorable position. The United States still has the world's largest and most sophisticated economy. We are still the only country in the world with truly global military capabilities. We still spend more on national security than the next 12 countries put together. And most of those countries are our allies, which even makes it more lopsided. We are still separated from the other major powerful countries in the world by these two enormous oceans, and we're still protected further by the deterrent power of thousands of nuclear weapons. We have no serious enemies anywhere nearby. Indeed, American territory hasn't been invaded since 1812, right? That history is very different than the history of France or Russia or Germany or China or Japan. Even England lost 50,000 people at home during World War II. Nothing like that has happened to us except for the American Civil War, and we did that to ourselves. But ironically, this remarkably favorable position, one any country could envy, makes it somewhat harder to run a successful foreign policy. First, when you're so strong and so safe, it's hard to resist the temptation to try and remake the world in your own image. As Bush's national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, that's the first President Bush, put it back in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, we found ourselves at the pinnacle of power with the rarest opportunity to reshape the world. Hard to resist that temptation. And as a result, since that day, both Democrats and Republicans have pursued a rather ambitious American grand strategy. You might call it liberal hegemony. And by liberal, I don't mean liberal versus conservative. I mean rather the idea of promoting certain core liberal values, a liberal international order of democracy, rule of law, open markets, international institutions. Both Republicans and Democrats have tried to push that very strongly. In particular, we seek a clear position of military primacy over all other countries, and we maintain powerful military forces in every corner of the world. No other country does that today, and no one runs for president in this country, not even Bernie Sanders, saying his goal is to make America #2. This strategy sees the United States as the indispensable power which should take the lead in addressing almost all global problems. In other words, we have the right and the responsibility to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction, expand NATO, manage the Middle East peace process, run key international economic institutions, lead the fight against climate change, and a lot of other things too. This calls for us to use our power to spread democracy, advance human rights, expand the rule of law, and promote open markets. Spreading liberal values is going to be good for us, so this argument runs, good for the world, and any countries that don't like it should be pressured to go along and, if necessary, overthrown. Bottom line here is the United States is not, in fact, or has not been a status quo power just trying to keep things as they are. We have been actively and energetically trying to move the world in our image, get other countries to embrace our preferences. Now, the argument is, and there's a coherent argument in favor of this, is that it will keep threats at bay, maintain an open economy which is good for American prosperity, and gradually promote a set of values we find more congenial, especially values of freedom, liberty, democracy, and the like. And because we're so powerful and so secure, doing all these things seemed feasible, especially back at the moment that the Cold War ended and we seemed supreme. Unfortunately, as I think we've seen over the last 20 years, this strategy has several obvious problems. First and most obviously, it means the foreign policy agenda is always overcrowded. It's hard to decide which problems deserve the most attention at any given time, and to see that, you just have to look at all the places and all the problems John Kerry is trying to deal with. Just look at his flight itinerary. He's trying to deal with Iran, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Syria, the South China Sea, climate change, Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as students here know, if you try to take 15 classes in a semester, you're not going to do very well at any of them, and that's at least part of the problem. Second, because we're already in such good shape, it wasn't worth spending enormous amounts of blood or treasure on any of these problems. So our foreign policy is both hugely ambitious, but also somewhat feckless. We try to do a lot, but we try to do it all on the cheap. So we're willing to expand NATO, but only on the assumption that we never actually have to defend any of NATO's new members, some of which, it turns out, are rather hard to defend. After 9/11, we invade Afghanistan and then Iraq, but we assume both wars will be quick, cheap, pay for themselves, so we never raise taxes to pay for either one or send enough troops for long enough to succeed. We're not willing to intervene in Syria, which, by the way, I agree with, because it's expensive, risky, and it might take decades to actually solve the problem. So an ambitious foreign policy, but not one we're really willing to work that hard on. Third, supporters of this strategy assumed other countries would actually be grateful for what we were trying to do. But instead, Russia resented and feared the expansion of NATO eastward and eventually invaded Ukraine in part to put a stop to it, to say it's not going to go any further. You might not like this, but what do you think the United States would do if a hostile power somewhere else were starting to form military alliances in the Western Hemisphere? We'd probably do something about it. We certainly have in the past. Fear of American pressure, or fear that we would inaugurate regime change, encouraged some states to seek weapons of mass destruction as a way of deterring us from doing that, which is not, of course, what we wanted. And finally, American protection allowed many of our allies to free ride, so we end up bearing most of the burden. The United States spends about 4% of its GDP on national security of all kinds. Our allies in Europe spend less than 2%. Japan, the world's #3 economy, spends about 1%. And finally, trying to spread democracy, and especially trying to do it at the point of a gun, turned out to be something we had no idea how to do. The American military is extremely good at deterring conventional aggression. It's pretty good at toppling weak governments like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. But as we now know, that's the easy part. The American military, indeed the entire American government, is very bad at running other countries or turning them into genuine democracies, especially when they're poor, deeply divided, and they lack any real experience with democracy itself. Instead of being easy and cheap, in short, trying to create this world of stable, pro-American, liberal democracies, cost trillions of dollars, produced a bunch of failed states, made the United States less popular, created power vacuums that adversaries could exploit, and then we reacted to those reactions by compromising our own ideals, whether by torturing prisoners we thought might be terrorists or launching unprecedented levels of government surveillance here at home. What I'm suggesting is that our very favorable position in the world has this downside. When any country is as powerful and as secure as we really are, it's easy to do dumb things because you don't really have to be smart. Which then raises the following question: how did all these smart people in the US government get things so wrong? And this leads me to look at the foreign policy establishment as a whole. All right, this is a democracy, so policy isn't just determined by the president or even by his cabinet. It's actually shaped by a wide array of institutions throughout society, and that's especially true here in the United States because we have such an open system of government. So you can't just look at the government itself or even the foreign policy bureaucracy. You have to look at what I would call the entire foreign policy community. And I'm going to describe that and then say where I think it may go wrong. Well, first of all, you would want to include the formal institutions of government, state, the president, the National Security Council, etc. By one estimate, just to give you a sense of how big this is, there are 700,000 civilian employees in the Department of Defense alone. That's not the intelligence community, that's not the State Department, that's not Treasury, that's just DOD. There are a vast array of companies and contractors. By one estimate, we have 1,000 federal organizations and 2,000 private companies working in the field of counterterrorism now. They're not all huge, some of them are small, but that's a lot of people. 850,000 Americans now have top secret clearances. Some of them may even be in this room. So we have a large government establishment in charge of foreign affairs, but it doesn't end there. You then have membership organizations like World Affairs Councils, Council on Foreign Relations, Veterans of Foreign Wars, who all try to raise public awareness of foreign policy and discuss different issues. There are think tanks like the Brookings Institution, the Carnegie Endowment, the American Enterprise Institute, and many other specialized organizations. Then there are special interest groups and lobbies that intervene in politics to try and advance some cause, and there's a huge array of them too. Human rights groups, defense contractors, arms control organizations, the US Chamber of Commerce, ethnic lobbies of various kinds. You would also have to include those parts of the media that cover foreign affairs, because that shapes a lot of what the public actually knows. And last but not least, don't leave out academics, scholars who write books and articles, who sometimes serve in government themselves, or who train people who go into government. Many of my colleagues at the Kennedy School, such as the current Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, are perfect illustrations of this. So there's a lot of people involved in this process. There are two features of this community that deserve special emphasis. First, it is in fact a community, especially at the highest levels. People in this world know each other well. They do a lot of mutual back scratching. In the old phrase, you go along to get along. Members of these various institutions often overlap, and key people within it often hold multiple positions in the course of a career. Just as a couple of illustrations of this, the biography of somebody like Leslie Gelb is perfect. He gets a PhD at Harvard, right? Studying, by the way, with Henry Kissinger, goes to teach at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Then he becomes an aide to a senator on Capitol Hill. Then he goes to the Pentagon, where he helps write the Pentagon Papers. Then he goes as a senior fellow to the Brookings Institution, where he writes a book about Vietnam. Then in the Carter administration, he's into the State Department, where he runs the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. Then he comes out and becomes the national security correspondent for the New York Times, and eventually ends up as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, right? Or consider my former colleague, Samantha Power. She works as a journalist, writing about the Balkan Wars in the 90s, then goes to Harvard Law School, starts teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School, writes a prize-winning book on genocide, joins Barack Obama's Senate staff when he goes to the Senate, and then comes with him to the White House and is now UN ambassador for the United States. And I could multiply examples like this over and over. So people in this world often move around into different positions in the different parts of it. Well, because it's a community and everybody knows everybody else, professional success, professional advancement depends on preserving a positive reputation. And that means staying within the acceptable consensus, not saying anything too far outside the lines or even outside the lines at all. And in fact, despite all of the partisan warfare you read about and see in Washington, there's remarkable consensus within that foreign policy community about the broad outlines. There are disagreements about tactics and about specific issues, but hardly anybody in that community questions the basic principles of liberal hegemony that I outlined before. Both Democrats and Republicans are committed to active U.S. global leadership, to using American power to pressure others. And one good illustration of that is that virtually all of the senior officials in the Obama administration during his first term in 2009, including Hillary Clinton, supported the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The only prominent member of the Obama administration who didn't was Obama himself. In short, what I'm suggesting is there's two imbalances of power in the world. There's the imbalance of power between the United States and everybody else, which has some really nice features to it, as well as some problems. But there's also an imbalance of power between organizations and individuals who favor active American global leadership and those who want a little bit more restraint. To be just a little bit more specific, I don't believe the American military or the intelligence services or the Department of State are warmongers, but they do tend to define American interests very broadly, and they tend to see the whole world as brimming with dangers we must be ready to address at any time. Notice, if the United States were doing a little bit less in the world, their budgets and their status would shrink. Organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations or Brookings or the American Enterprise Institute all actively support American global leadership. In fact, many of them were created to help convince Americans to play a more active global role. Now, people in those groups don't agree on every particular policy issue, so you get disagreements over, say, what we ought to do in Syria or what we ought to be doing in the South China Sea, but they all tend to lean towards greater involvement rather than less. And then, of course, there's this vast number of interest groups and lobbies, all of them generally trying to get the American government to do something somewhere on behalf of somebody. Forces favoring a more restrained American posture they do exist, but they're less numerous, less well-funded, much less influential. If you put all this together and you have a powerful tendency for the United States to get overcommitted, because most of the groups, most of the individuals who are responsible for foreign policy are strongly inclined to lean that way. Now, if you step back for a second, that's not all that surprising. People get interested in foreign policy because they want to do something to make the world a better place. They want to make the American people safer or more prosperous. But notice that global activism is also in their own self-interest. The more ambitious U.S. foreign policy is, the more influence, power, money these groups and these organizations are likely to get. And by the way, I would include schools of public policy like my own employer. And remember, once you start rising in that world, you'll do almost anything to keep from being thrown out of it. right, which means, again, going along. Now, one way to see that is that membership in this establishment, people in it, tend to be much more supportive of global activism than the public at large. On the one hand, the public generally thinks that the United States should be a global leader, and support for that has been at about 70% in public opinion polls going back 30, 40, 50 years. But on the other hand, the American people now seem to think very strongly that the United States is bearing too large a share. In 2006, 60% of Americans said they thought that the United States was doing more than its share to solve global problems. In 2013, 52% of Americans believed the United States should mind its own business in international affairs. In 2013 also, 51% said the United States is doing too much, but among Council on Foreign Relations members, it was only 21%. American people, 51%, Council on Foreign Relations, only 21%. In 2013, 80% agree with the following proposition: the United States should think not so much in international terms, but concentrate on its own national interests. Own national problems. A majority of Americans oppose using U.S. troops to defend Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, even though those countries are all NATO members and we are formally committed to defend them. 53% of Americans oppose using American troops to defend Israel. Over 80% oppose using American troops to defend Taiwan. And finally, last year, a Wall Street Journal poll found only 19% of Americans wanted the country to be more active in world affairs. The percentage supporting a less active foreign policy had increased from 14% to 47%. So that raises a new question. How does the establishment that wants global activism convince a somewhat skeptical public to support a wildly ambitious global strategy? They use a number of arguments to do this, and I want to summarize what I think are the biggest ones. The first one, of course, is threat inflation, is to exaggerate dangers, because that's the way to convince the American people to engage in every corner of the world. As I've suggested, we're by far the most secure great power in modern history. Yet since World War II, we have tended to treat what were sometimes minor problems as if they were god-awful imminent dangers. So in the McCarthy period, many Americans genuinely believed that communists were infiltrating all sorts of key American institutions, including the Department of State itself. Wasn't true. Many people believed it. During Vietnam, many Americans, including American leaders, genuinely believed that withdrawal or defeat in Vietnam would cause dominoes to fall and undermine America's entire global position. Turns out we did lose in Vietnam, we did withdraw, and 14 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed, not the United States. Today, we treat third-rate powers like Iran as if they're 10 feet tall. Iran's defense budget is about $20 billion a year. Ours is about $500 billion, yet we tend to see it as a major global rival. It's a problem, no doubt about it, but we tend to treat it as much bigger than it really is. We obsess about the danger from international terrorism, but the good news is the actual danger you face from terrorism is quite small. Statistically, you are more likely to die slipping in your bathroom than being killed by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or any other international terrorist. If you take all of the terrorist attacks since the year 2000, including 9/11, the actual risk for an American citizen is about 1 chance in 3.5 million each year that you'll be affected by terrorism. The US population is well over 300 million now. Total American deaths from international terrorism in 2013, 16 people. Total global deaths from international terrorism outside war zones. So I'm not talking about, say, where the war with ISIS is happening, not talking about Nigeria where Boko Haram is operating. Outside war zones, in other places, is roughly 1,000 people a year. Now that's 1,000 too many, but it does put the danger in some perspective. I want to be very clear about this. What happened to the United States on 9/11, what has happened in places like Paris or Oslo or Jakarta or Madrid or San Bernardino is disturbing, and we should take reasonable steps to deal with it. But none of those attacks pose an existential threat to our way of life or our society unless we let ourselves be intimidated by them, or we let ourselves be stampeded into doing something foolish, which of course is one of the things that groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS are trying to do. They say this openly, that they are trying to provoke us to react in ways that will advance their cause rather than inhibit it. Now, again, I'm not suggesting there are no dangers in the world. I'm suggesting that our foreign policy establishment has an incentive to exaggerate them. Politicians want to work overtime to scare us in order to mobilize support for an ambitious agenda. Now, to make matters worse, foreign policy turns out to be one of those areas where it's actually hard to have a genuine and well-informed debate. In theory, a democracy should be able to debate alternatives pretty openly. Bad ideas could get weeded out by being forced to thrash them out in public discussion. And I think that's true in general, but it doesn't work as well in this particular realm. First of all, in foreign policy and defense policy, government officials have lots of ways to manipulate information. They can classify things they don't want you to know about. They can prosecute journalists or whistleblowers who try to expose secrets. And at the same time, they can leak information, and all governments do that. Certainly all American administrations do. They can leak information selectively to build support for what they want to do. Unfortunately, most of us don't have independent ways to determine what's actually happening in different parts of the world. If the roads are crumbling, if the economy's in bad shape, if the schools are falling apart, we can see that for ourselves. We can observe it where we live. But what we know about Al-Qaeda, about the political situation in Afghanistan, about trade policy, about Iran's nuclear program, a lot of that information comes straight from government officials. It comes straight from the foreign policy establishment I've already described. And that problem is magnified by what I would call an increasingly incestuous relationship between government and media. Reporters and editors depend on close ties with people in power, and with some notable exceptions, they're part of this same club as well. That's why, before the Iraq War, the New York Times and the Washington Post, highly prestigious newspapers, were fed false information by the Bush administration, and they published it uncritically, something that the Times at least has admitted was a low point in their performance. But by the way, hardly anyone at those institutions was held accountable for this lapse. Back in 2008, the Pentagon was giving special tours and VIP briefings to retired generals, and then taking those generals and giving their names to media organizations. So if you wanted to know what was going on, media organizations would contact these generals who'd been given these special briefings about what was happening in Iraq or what was happening in Afghanistan. The result was the American people got fed an overly upbeat view of how both of these wars were going. What's even more interesting, a couple of generals didn't go along with the program, right, and got taken off the list immediately. Even worse, we have subjects where there's little or no debate at all, where it's very hard to have a public discussion. Until very recently, there's been really no serious debate about American Middle East policy, and in particular, the American relationship with either Saudi Arabia or with Israel, and especially not if you wanted to advance in Washington, even though it's been clear that our relations with both of those countries were deeply problematic and contributing to our problems in the Middle East. Finally, media loves to exaggerate threats. Just look at the Weather Channel. Because, of course, that's how you keep people watching. So CNN and Fox and MSNBC have an orgy of coverage every time some terrorist incident happens everywhere, because, again, that's a way to keep our eyeballs glued on the screen, which is, of course, exactly what groups like ISIS want, is to keep us obsessing about them. So in foreign policy, there isn't as much debate about the broad outlines. Officials have a great ability to shape public opinion, and most of the media tends to enable this rather than question it. Third problem, U.S. foreign policy may be failing because we actually don't do a very good job of holding people accountable. Consider that no high-level civilian officials or high-level military officers were held accountable for the failures at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq or for the use of torture. Consider the case of Elliot Abrams. He was convicted of lying to Congress during the Reagan administration. He was pardoned by the first President Bush. He got reappointed to the second Bush administration, where he supported the Iraq War, but he also later helped foment a civil war in Gaza between Hamas and Fatah, where Hamas was supposed to lose, but he blew it, and Hamas ended up in control. In other words, despite this long record of failure, when he leaves government, he's appointed a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Second example, Paul Wolfowitz. He was a Defense Department official who predicted that the invasion of Iraq and occupation would pay for itself. When he left the Pentagon 4 years later, President Bush appointed him president of the World Bank, even though he wasn't an economist or a development expert. He then resigned that position about 18 months later after a flurry of ethics violations and lands a nice sinecure at the American Enterprise Institute. This doesn't just happen at the top. There's the case of Elizabeth Obeji. She was a supposed Syria expert working at a DC think tank. She was forced to resign her position. She'd gotten a lot of publicity, been in media, written some op-eds and things. It turns out she had falsely claimed to have a PhD, so she was fired. 2 weeks later, she got hired to work for John McCain. It's not just a Republican problem. The Director of Central Intelligence, James Clapper, told Congress that the National Security Agency was not spying on Americans. That got exposed as incorrect. He admitted he had not told the truth. He apologized. Lying to Congress is a felony. He still has his job, the full support of the president, and that's also true for the head of the CIA, John Brennan, who denied that the CIA was spying on congressional staff members and then had to apologize when the CIA's internal investigation confirmed that they, in fact, had done essentially that. He still has his job. Meanwhile, whose careers suffer? The people who get it right. And let me give you one example. Colonel Paul Yingling, an Army officer, served several tours in Iraq, and after one of his tours, he wrote an article criticizing the senior leadership in the Army for how they were running the war. It's called A Failure of Generalship. Did he publish this anonymously? No, he put his name on it. This is an article that's widely praised for being an accurate appraisal of command failures in Iraq. It's been assigned at West Point. It's been assigned at the Command and General Staff College. I will ask a question that you all know the answer to. Did he rise in the U.S. Army? No. He's now teaching high school in Colorado. That's not a bad thing. I'm sure he's an outstanding high school teacher, but of course we'd be better off if those who spoke the truth were recognized for it. It is worth noting, by the way, and I want to make it clear, I'm not anti-military here, the most common reason American military commanders are fired or relieved of command: sexual misconduct, not poor performance in battle. Yet notice we have not been winning the wars we've been fighting, which suggests either that the commanders aren't leading well or they are not telling our civilian leadership what they need to hear before they get involved. In other words, despite all the partisanship you see in DC, the foreign policy world is in some respects a self-protecting community now, where you're insulated from failure. There's sort of no policy screw-up sufficient to derail your career. And I want to drive that point home with just one final anecdote. This is advice that my colleague Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, gave to Senator Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, shortly after her election. She's been elected to the Senate. She's about to go to Washington. She goes to see him to get his advice on how to be an effective performer in Washington. And this is what she writes in one of her books. He teed it up this way: I had a choice. I could be an insider or I could be an outsider. Outsiders can say whatever they want, but people on the inside don't listen to them. Insiders get lots of access and a chance to push their ideas. People, powerful people, listen to what they have to say. But insiders understand one unbreakable rule. They don't criticize other insiders. Now, I think Summers is right. I think he's accurately describing the climate. But this is not a healthy situation. If the people who get things repeatedly wrong pay little or no price and just get reappointed when the political winds blow the right way, and if the people who get things right don't get recognized, then how do you expect to do better over time? All right, there's one final problem, and then I will end with, again, as I promised, a note of optimism. We may have designed a system for staffing the executive branch that is the worst of all possible worlds. Each president has to fill about 3,000 appointed positions, including at least 800 that require Senate confirmation. This means tremendous turnover whenever the White House changes parties, usually even if it just changes the occupant. Bringing in people who often lack experience, aren't necessarily fully up to speed. It's as if Apple or General Electric or IBM replaced its entire upper management team every 4 or 8 years. Politics is different, but no other major power operates this way. No other democracy has quite the same house cleaning that we have. But at the same time, the appointments and confirmation process has gone completely off the rails. What with how long the background checks take for presidential appointees, and for those ones who need Senate confirmation, the months, sometimes years it takes for the Senate to confirm, which means there are key positions from assistant secretary up that remain unfilled for the first several years of a presidential administration. You have this extraordinarily ambitious foreign policy that you're trying to run with lots of positions empty. Again, it's like, trying to go to the Super Bowl and say, we're only going to play 6 players, and we think we're going to win. To make matters worse, as you all know, we have this 4-year presidential term and an election campaign that lasts over a year. Canada just had the longest election in its entire history. It was 78 days. I've never been so envious of Canadians in all my life. What this means, of course, is that the country is completely distracted for 25% of every president's term. And finally, we're the only major power that routinely gives amateurs key diplomatic positions. About 1/3 of U.S. ambassadors overseas are not professional diplomats. They are people who gave lots of money to help whoever's president get elected. Some of them actually turn out to do a great job, but again, no other country runs its diplomacy this way. Well, if you put all these reasons together, the question to ask is not why American foreign policy often fails, but rather why it ever succeeds. And the answer goes all the way back to my very first point. The United States is in such a favorable position. We are so powerful. We have such capabilities. We can make lots of mistakes and still be mostly okay. And that's sort of the optimistic note I'm going to end on. Although we seem to be pretty bad at foreign policy these days, maybe it doesn't matter that much. China is likely to face significant problems in the years ahead. A very unfavorable demographic profile, the need to adjust its economy in some really fundamental and very hard to do ways, endemic corruption that they are trying to deal with, but itself then causes considerable political tensions within. So China will face headwinds. The European Union is mired in deep economic and political problems that will take an enormous amount of time to resolve. It is very hard to be optimistic. And it's also a continent that is losing population and where the population is aging very rapidly, which has its own economic consequences. The Middle East will be racked by instability for many years to come. India, Brazil, and Turkey, which were all doing very well a few years ago, are all facing certain headwinds economically and politically. And in the meantime, the American economy recovered faster than the rest from the financial crisis than the rest of the advanced industrial countries. Our population is younger than the other major powers, and it's still growing. Our society is still a magnet for talented people from all over the world, and we're even close to energy independence. in terms of the global balance of power, in terms of the big forces shaping world politics, the United States is likely to be in pretty good shape for many years to come unless we suffer from too many self-inflicted wounds, which merely confirms Otto von Bismarck's famous observation that there is a special providence that looks after drunkards, fools, and the United States of America. He really did say that. And given how we tend to deal with foreign policy these days, we can only hope that Bismarck was right. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would be delighted to take questions, comments, violent disagreements, actually spirited disagreements, but not violence. The gentleman there was the first hand, and then the woman right in front of you, in blue shirt.
What do you think the prospects for wait for the microphone, please?
Okay.
Thank you. What do you think the prospects for Russia are in the next 10 years?
Not good. But let me elaborate. Everyone heard the question. Prospects for Russia in the next 10 years. I'll say two things about this. I think Vladimir Putin has played a bad hand very well. Russia's overall power profile looks bleak. It's a rapidly aging population. Life expectancy, in fact, has been going down in Russia. It's shrinking. I think it'll go from 140 million people to 110 by the year 2050. Its major economic asset has been energy, oil and gas, and with oil prices low and likely to stay low for quite some time, which is my read, and I think what most experts would forecast, this has significant implications for Russia over time. And you know, people are not flocking to buy Russian cell phones, to buy Russian consumer products, to buy Russian steel, et cetera. It's not that they don't have an economy, but it's not an economy that looks like it has a lively future. So Russia's long-term position is that of a declining power, in my view. Having said that, they've played a weak hand well, because what he's done, I think, quite cleverly or effectively, is take on limited and reasonable objectives that are within their capacities. They have not tried to do something beyond their capacity. So in Ukraine, they didn't try to take over all of Ukraine. They just tried to make it impossible for Ukraine to move into the West in the way that some Ukrainians wanted to, right? And they've succeeded in doing that. Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO anytime soon. That's it. They're not going to try and take over and run the whole place. It's been costly. It's had real costs for Russia, but it was feasible to do that. Similarly, in Syria, they had a very simple objective: keep the Assad government in power in at least most of the important parts of Syria. Full stop. That's all we're trying to accomplish. We're not necessarily trying to put the whole place together. We're not trying to defeat ISIS, reconcile Iraq, not let al-Qaeda take power anywhere else, right? They had a very limited objective, and one that their capabilities were, well, that's part of keeping Assad in power, keeps their access to the military base they have there. It's, by the way, it's not much of a military base, but it's the one foothold they still have in the Middle East. So in that sense, I think they've played their cards, you know, again, relatively weak cards, pretty well. But do I think of Russia as this reincarnation of the old Soviet Union with a vast global agenda posing an imminent threat to Western Europe or even Eastern Europe? No, I don't think that they have the capabilities, and the capabilities will be going down over time. Yes, the woman right here is who I pointed to.
I'm not sure you haven't already answered this, but I'd like to know if you could expound a little further on it. How does this corrupt country of ours keep stumbling along as well as it does?
Well, I did say a lot about that. I mean, partly I'll put it in two baskets. One is we're a very lucky country, right? We've had an extraordinarily fortunate history, right? as a nation. Being located in the Western Hemisphere turned out to be a huge gift, right? The original colonists from Europe, stumbled on a gold mine. A rich continent filled with natural resources. There was an indigenous population. We weren't very good to them. But in terms of geopolitics, is incredibly favorable. And we've ended up with neighbors that were relatively easy to deal with. So that's an extraordinary act of good fortune. And we always forget about that. We always think that our position in the world is because we're so virtuous and wonderful. It's partly that, but it's also that we got lucky. The second part is there's many strengths in the United States, right? It's still, I think, a remarkably entrepreneurial society, welcoming that in various ways. We have more flexible labor markets than a lot of other societies as well. We still have, by far, the best institutions of higher education. K through 12, not so much, but higher education and all of the technology spin-offs that generates, you'd rather be in the United States than almost anywhere else. So lots of real virtues. And as a colleague of mine pointed out a few months ago, you'd start to worry when American hedge fund billionaires were starting to buy condominiums in Shanghai so that they had a safe place to go if things went south in the United States, all right? But of course, what you see is the exact opposite. You see wealthy Chinese buying up property in California, Russian oligarchs buying condos in Manhattan, people from Latin America, you may have seen a few of them around here, right? This turns out to be a very safe place to park your money because it's not going to get nationalized. There probably won't be a violent revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have a legal system that actually works. So this is a place that's, for all of the problems I pointed to, and I think those are real problems, there are a lot of real virtues in this place, and that's one of the reasons that we're able to make as many mistakes as we do. I just think we'd be better off if we made fewer of them. Why don't we go over here to this woman, and then we'll go back to the man in the, I don't even know what color, teal shirt. Right, yes.
In the sphere of foreign policy, what's the probability of improvement if we have a former Secretary of State as president, in spite of all the issues she's had as Secretary of State?
You must be referring to Mrs. Clinton. I was going to say John Kerry's not running, but I knew I would get asked about the campaign, and I'm not endorsing anybody. I haven't given money to any of the candidates or anything like that. I think the most obvious thing, well, two things to say. One is presidents surprise people, right? What they say in a campaign is often a little different than what they end up doing in office. So you may recall that George W. Bush ran for office promising a more humble foreign policy, and in particular criticizing the Clinton administration for excessive focus on nation building. Right? That we had gotten involved in all these strange countries around the world. We're not going to do that. I'm going to focus on great power relations, and I'm going to have a humble foreign policy. And I don't think he was lying. I think that's what he thought he wanted to do. And then September 11th happened, and everything changed, and he ends up doing these vast nation-building projects in Afghanistan and Iraq. So what presidents do, similarly, Barack Obama has done all sorts of things that some of his supporters were horrified by. Greatly increasing the American reliance on drones, for example, escalating the American military presence in Afghanistan, which is not what you would necessarily have expected in the 2008 campaign as well. So presidents surprise us sometimes. That said, Hillary does have a track record, right, as First Lady, as Senator, as Secretary of State, and her team, and she has a very large foreign policy team now, is a familiar set of names, experienced people who, most of whom came out of the Clinton administration or the first Obama term. They are all, I think, sort of what I would call card-carrying members of this sort of foreign policy establishment that believes in liberal hegemony and global activism. So she's the easiest of all the candidates, she's the easiest to predict. If you think what we've been doing for the last 20 years has worked pretty well, you're going to get more of that, right? And maybe a little bit more of a hawkish edge to it in some places. She wanted to go into Syria. She was a big supporter of the intervention in Libya as well within the administration, big driver. And she voted and openly spoke in favor of the war in Iraq. So that's Hillary. We kind of know what we're getting. Not crazy, not experienced, quite knowledgeable, but not very creative. Now, if you think that what we really need is some outside-the-box thinking right now, that's probably not the team or the candidate that's going to bring it to you. If you think we're basically okay and we can continue to stumble along, then you'd be less worried about that. Someone will probably ask me about others, but I...
With respect to the foreign policy team today and the issue of the Apple encryption and what that will do in foreign policy.
Right. Interestingly, this question got raised. I spoke in front of a class here earlier this morning, and the same question came up. I'll say, I hope, pretty much the same thing I said this morning. First of all, this is not a subject that I'm deeply knowledgeable about, and there are parts of it where there's some really technical aspects that I wish I were more expert. Nor have I thought long and hard about the implications of it. That said, I'm on Apple's side in this one, but for two reasons. One is I am sort of a big believer in privacy. I think there are things that it's nobody's business but mine, as long as it's not illegal, it's not as it's harming anyone else, and I would just as soon not have anybody, including the US government, snooping around at some aspects of my life. I don't want them accessing my hard drive and running through it. And we know that governments everywhere, including our own, sometimes find it really hard to resist temptation, right? Once a capability exists. So I worry about that. The second reason, though, of course, is there is, again, this is what my computer science friends tell me, and it's been in the press, there's no way to create a backdoor for the US government into your iPhone without making that a backdoor that others can exploit too. There's just no way to do it. And there's lots of other intelligence agencies around the world and criminals out there around the world who are doing this all the time. You may have had an invasion of your home computer at one time or another. There's simply no way to do it. And Apple's position has been saying, look, we can create a situation where you don't have to worry about your iPhone being monitored, hacked by anybody. But once we open a door for someone, others are going to find ways to get in that, right? And then can use it in a variety of other ways. So if you're trying to enhance security for the country as a whole, you have to weigh the sort of benefit. Do we really want to know what's on the San Bernardino killer's iPhone? It might be useful, it might be nothing, right? It might be helpful. Or do we want to try and maximize the degree of security that the rest of us feel most of the time against the full range of dangers that are out there in the cyber world? So I'm on Apple's side until I hear an argument on the other side that persuades me I'm wrong. Yeah, let's come over here to this gentleman here. I'll try to get to as many of you as possible.
Thank you. There was something I didn't fully understand about your broad concept that you introduced in your lecture that I was hoping you could clarify. If I understood you right, you were saying that up until about 1992, our foreign policy was basically doing pretty well, and that after 1992, we started to face some really serious headwinds and screwed up a lot. Is that a fair summary of your premise?
I'll clarify. It's close. I was mostly pointing out that it's not that Americans are congenitally bad at doing foreign policy. You can find periods in our history where we were facing novel, difficult, challenging situations and where the people in charge, in my judgment, did a pretty good job of responding to those in an intelligent, measured, smart, and effective way. And this is bipartisan. I basically give the Truman administration in the late 40s credit for some remarkably innovative and successful diplomacy, and I give the first Bush administration, 88 to 92, again, credit for dealing with a really remarkable set of circumstances pretty well.
Well, here's my question.
Okay.
That wasn't my question, I'm sorry, but my question is this. First of all, I think you I would claim that you have glossed over some episodes before 1992 that maybe some of us remember, like a little thing called the Vietnam War that didn't go so well. I think there were lots of others as well. I think that Dulles and the foreign policy establishment under Eisenhower can be questioned. So I'm not sure that I accept your premise. But setting that aside, I don't understand what changed in 1992. I didn't get from your lecture what you were saying had happened. I mean, the foreign policy establishment that you described and vilified didn't change in 1992. You made that pretty clear in your lecture. All of that was the case in the 50s and the 40s. It was smaller, but it was inbred and ingrown just like that. I don't think the foreign policy establishment has ever been friendly to critics. It's always ostracized the critics and loved the supporters. So it wasn't clear, that was a big part of your argument, and I didn't see how that had changed in 92. Maybe it did, but it wasn't clear to me. And anyhow, I don't want to go on and on, but I didn't get what changed in 92. It seemed to me that the problems you were describing are problems we've always had. And we just didn't handle them well after 92 for some reason that I didn't get. So anyhow, if you could clarify that or tell me I'm stupid.
No, not stupid. Very smart question. In everything you just said, the hardest thing I think for me to deal with would be Vietnam, because Vietnam is clearly a huge foreign policy blunder, costly in a variety of ways. Ultimately, we come out of it okay in the sense that we're a very powerful, wealthy country, so we took our lumps. People suffered in Indochina. Americans suffered as a result of it. But as I indicated, at the end of the day, it didn't, in fact, affect the global balance of power, which is what many of the critics of the war said all along, that this is not worth what we're investing in it. And of course, people in the government, we now know, kind of recognized that all along. They just couldn't figure out a way to extricate themselves. Vietnam is the hardest sort of case for the argument that things are somehow worse now. I actually think the U.S. performance in the 50s, it has its problems, particularly in our relations with much of the developing world. But first of all, Eisenhower was pretty sensible. Dulles, not so much. But Eisenhower got a lot of the big things right about sort of transatlantic relations, dealing with major powers. They didn't do as good a job in the developing world, but fortunately, it didn't matter. We didn't go into Vietnam under Eisenhower in '54 when the French wanted us to. We did sort of restrain our allies in '56. They didn't try rollback in the Hungarian Revolution. So I would give Eisenhower more credit. What happened, what changes in '92 is the sense of constraint. Suddenly, the Soviet Union's gone, and the sense that the United States is supreme, on top of the world, can do whatever it wants without consequences becomes, I think, we lose the discipline of having a real enemy, if you will. So the Clinton administration, which in a funny way gets off easy, and I'll explain why, their grand strategy statement was this thing that came out originally in '94, a national strategy of engagement and enlargement. We're going to engage the world, and we're going to enlarge the sphere of democratic rule. We're going to spread democracy around the world. We're going to expand NATO as far as we can into Eastern Europe, which was a Clinton administration initiative, which immediately guaranteed that the relationship with Russia was going to get worse. And the Clinton people didn't believe this. They kept saying, no, but we are not hostile to Russia. We like Russia. We want to have a good relationship. This is not an anti-Russian action. And I think they meant it sincerely. They didn't think it was an anti-Russian action. The problem was it didn't matter what we thought. It mattered what the Russians thought. And they saw it as an anti-Russian action. The second Clinton, and which has now come back to haunt us in various ways, the second Clinton administration initiative was dual containment. All right, in the Persian Gulf, we announced in 1993 that we are now going to follow a policy of simultaneously containing Iraq and Iran. The U.S. is going to do that. These are two countries that hate each other, and we're going to oppose both. Previously, our policy had been to play them off against each other. Let Iraq balance Iran or Iran balance Iraq. Now we're going to do both. To do that, we had to keep thousands of troops in Saudi Arabia and a few in Kuwait as well. And that's one of the things that led Osama bin Laden, who saw this as an affront to having these infidel troops in Saudi Arabia, to decide to attack the United States. Clinton was out of office by then, but part of the taproot of 9/11 happens on Clinton's watch. He's just lucky enough to get out of office before it happens. What I think is changing, in other words, one final thing. If you had this bright idea in 1975 or 1985 of invading Iraq, I think the thing to do is get rid of Saddam Hussein. He's real trouble. He's a bad guy. We should just overthrow him. If you'd proposed that in Washington, D.C. in 1975 or 1985, someone would have immediately said, do you realize that Iraq is allied with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union has thousands of nuclear weapons, and if we invade a Soviet client state, we could be starting World War III. Oh, right, sorry, bad idea. By 1994, 5, 6, 7, people who thought we should have gone to Baghdad in 91 could start proposing the idea of invading Iraq, and it was much harder to argue against it. They didn't persuade Clinton, right? He agreed to sanctions and a few other things against Iraq. They didn't persuade him to use military force against Iraq in large quantities, but the idea was out there, and you couldn't get rid of it, right? And then when the stars lined up in particular ways, and after the invasion of Afghanistan went so well at first, it was very hard to argue against it in 2003. So many of our problems stem from the fact that we have enormous latitude, but not necessarily the wisdom to know when not to do things that we think are possible. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the dissolution of the Soviet Union being probably the biggest factor in the change. But you haven't spoken anything about the internet and the populist uprisings in many countries and how that affects the foreign relations community. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. I won't be able to say very much about this, in part because I'm a little bit of a skeptic about the impact of the internet on global politics. I mean, we all know some of the obvious examples. The most vivid one today is ISIS using this as a recruiting tool, in various ways through social media. When the Arab Spring initially happened, the speed with which it happened was probably accelerated by the fact, not so much I think by Twitter and stuff like that, but by things like Al Jazeera, right? The fact that people in Egypt could watch on television what was happening in Tunisia and other places had more of an effect. And at this point, TV is not a big new internet phenomenon. So this notion that somehow the internet has empowered citizens but not governments, I think is too simple. Because, of course, governments can use the internet too. And one of the things they can do is monitor what people are doing. A friend of mine has this lovely joke where he pulls out his cell phone and says, you know what this is? This is a mobile government tracking device that also makes phone calls. Right? And authoritarian governments, of course, have discovered this, right? That this is the way of keeping track of activists as well as a way for activists to communicate with each other. Some authoritarian governments have also discovered that the internet, which is a big nebulous term, is also a good way to distract the population. So, the Russians have discovered that actually internet access is not a bad thing, because what do most people in Russia do with internet access? They don't organize civil society democracy organizations, they gamble and watch porn. And if you're gambling and watching a lot of porn, you're not getting out in the streets to rein in Putin. So for all those reasons, I am skeptical of the idea that the internet is transforming society in quite that way. But I could be wrong. I could really be wrong about this. It may be bigger than I think. We should go in the back, because people are, how about this gentleman here in the blue shirt, and then we'll move over to the other side.
Since Camp David Accords, there's been a permanent peace between Egypt and Israel.
Right.
Pretty much making a stalemate preventing any of the other Arab nations from effectively invading Israel because they have a secure border on the west. Are we in a permanent stalemate there now?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call it a stalemate. I think it's a totally one-sided now Israeli superiority. Your characterization of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty is exactly right. It took Egypt out of the equation, but even if it hadn't, if you look at sort of how the Israeli economy has performed, the amount of money they have spent on their own military, they now have, I think, complete military superiority over the worst imaginable Arab coalition you could try to put together. If you compare Israel's situation, say, in 1967, the Six-Day War, when they face Jordan, they face Egypt, they face Syria, and they face a little bit of help from, the Iraqis send a brigade and things like that. That's a serious problem, and those Arab countries had support from the Soviet Union, which was still in existence in those days, and Israel didn't have any nuclear weapons in 1967. Fast forward to today, Israel, although they don't admit it, has a couple of hundred nuclear weapons. Right? Israel has military superiority over any of its neighbors. It has a peace treaty with Egypt. It also has a peace treaty with Jordan. Right? Syria is not a military threat to Israel. You may have noticed Syria is in tatters right now. Iraq, which was never as big a military power as we thought, Iraq has fallen apart in particular. And the Saudis and Israelis are tacitly cooperating with each other on a whole series of issues because they're worried by all the same people at this point. So Israel's conventional military circumstances have never been more favorable. There's just no existential threat to Israel from conventional military power, and given that Israel has its own nuclear arsenal, it's hard to see another existential threat of any other kind. My view is the only serious threat Israel has is the Palestinian issue, right? And the demographic issue of trying to control all of greater Israel while there's still a Palestinian population that's denied all political rights. And that's a greater threat to Israel than any external threat that you could conjure up. Just my view. Let's go over here. Why don't we come down? Actually, can you come down to this woman here who's been patient, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt on the aisle? Yeah, in the pink jacket. Fuchsia, I think maybe it's the color.
Thanks. My question was, I think I understood your stand on the United States' involvement with military with other countries. But what would be your stand in regards to defending human rights? Should a country like the United States, who's powerful and rich, defend human rights, or is that too much of an involvement as well?
You're not going to get me to say no, we should not defend human rights. Of course we should, and I don't know anybody in the United States in this field that isn't in favor of trying to do what we can to do it, to advance human rights in general. All of the disagreements turn out to be trade-offs. Is it important to advance human rights, even if it's really expensive for us? How much pressure are you willing to put on China over its human rights policy if that jeopardizes trade with China, if that makes it harder to cooperate on other issues with China? Do you really want to push that issue when you don't think it's actually going to have much effect? And people can reach different judgments there, but there's sort of the trade-off question, and then there's the tactical or efficacy question. What's the best way of advancing human rights? So Muammar Gaddafi was an absolutely awful leader of Libya, and Libya's human rights performance the entire time he was the leader of Libya was atrocious. And we were worried, with some reason, that what was happening in Libya was going to lead to, if not genocide, I don't think it was anywhere close to that, but large-scale civilian loss of life. So you could make a case that getting rid of Gaddafi was an appropriate step on humanitarian or human rights grounds. Who's running Libya doesn't matter that much to us, but on human rights grounds, you could make that case, and that was precisely the case that was made when we went in. The only problem was nobody had an answer for how to run the place after the regime is dismantled, and kind of the only thing worse then a really bad government, like Gaddafi's, is no government at all, right? And so, that's a tactical question of what's the best way to advance this particular objective, and reasonable people are going to disagree on a case-by-case basis over what's the best way to do it. We should certainly stand for it. We should be public about it. And we should try to make sure that we're doing everything here in the United States so that we don't look like we're hypocritical. And once in a while, we do things that other countries will point out to us are less than ideal from a human rights point of view. I think the gentleman right there in the blue shirt.
In this election cycle, some presidential candidates have remarked about the need for regional state actors to step up in the fight against ISIS. Many of these states are pursuing independent aims, despite the fact that ISIS, at least in part, fits the profile of an aggressor with regard to your balance of threat theory vis-a-vis these states. My question is, do you think that regional rivalries can be put aside in order for these actors to balance against ISIS in a meaningful way that produces concrete results?
It almost sounds like you prepared that in advance. That's a very, very good question, and I guess I'd say two things. One of the challenges in dealing with the threat that ISIS poses is that a lot of regional actors think it's a problem. They just don't think it's their biggest problem. So Turkey doesn't like ISIS. It's quite clear. ISIS has staged attacks in Turkey. But the Turks are more worried about the Kurds for various reasons having to do with the Kurdish population in Turkey and history and all sorts of other things than they are about ISIS. And of course, the Turks are also deeply opposed to Assad for, again, various reasons. So ISIS may be sort of number 3 on the list if you're the Erdogan government, right? So they're not going to do very much against ISIS because they got other things to worry about. Similarly, you could say the same thing about Iran. Iran doesn't like ISIS either. ISIS is a Sunni movement, very radical, anti-Shia, opposed to the Shia government in Baghdad, which Iran has a pretty good relationship with. And in fact, Iranian-backed militias have been fighting ISIS. But of course, Iran also is allied with the Assad government, which is also opposed to ISIS, and maybe they're more worried about the situation in Syria than they are about ISIS. And if dealing with ISIS involves cooperating with us, that's a whole different can of worms. I could multiply this. Well, so part of the problem is we're like the only actor that thinks ISIS is the big problem that really needs to be solved, which is ironic given that we're the furthest away. The other issue is even if everybody agreed that ISIS was problem number 1, there's the classic collective action problem. Everybody would like somebody else to take the lead in doing it. And if the United States is willing to take the lead against ISIS, why wouldn't Baghdad, Riyadh, Ankara, and everybody else say, terrific, wonderful, over to you, have fun, right? It's what we used to do as a country, by the way. We used to be really good at getting other people to do the work. We've sort of forgotten how to do that. But in any event, I think this is a huge problem, the combination of the fact that there isn't consensus on the level of threat and the temptation to try and pass the buck to others. So one of the reasons I've argued in print that we should be doing as little as possible, probably not zero, but as little as possible, is to force others to do more, and in particular to force the Iraqi government, whose territory it ultimately is, to step up and allow for real military reform and real military training. My sense is that is having an effect. I mean, the Iraqi government has staged some successful offensive, has retaken some towns. The territory that ISIS controls has shrunk significantly over the past year. So this is moving in the right direction, but it's not something that's going to happen, overnight. And the more we take on, the more everybody else is going to free ride. I don't know where to go now.
We have time for one more question, and I'm going to make the decision for
You, thank you very much.
The gentleman behind the column.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Michael Small. Thank you for the presentation. My question, I like to go back to when you were talking about the discipline, about the how certain positions were free of discipline.
Mm-hmm.
My question to you is, what kind would disciplining said people who got away scot-free actually improve our foreign policy, or would it actually weaken it?
You mean like holding people accountable? Is that part of it? Okay.
And if not, why haven't we held people accountable?
Yeah, that's actually a terrific question, and I want to be sort of clear about it. I mean, I think that we have now a political system that's remarkably lax in not holding people accountable. And that's true within the U.S. military, and it's certainly true on the civilian side as well. Again, the number of people who have really, been wrong over and over and over again, and yet remain in positions of authority, whether it's as commentators or as advisors. You look at the people advising current presidential candidates, right? They either have teams that are not very successful, or they have no team at all. Right. My concern, by the way, I had to get this in about Trump and Sanders is I don't have any idea what their foreign policy would actually be like. We have no real evidence one way or the other. I look at the people who are advising Rubio, and these are the same people who thought invading Iraq was a brilliant idea. Right. So if you thought the first Bush term was great, he's your candidate. If you thought the Clinton administration was great, then she's your candidate. If you want a candidate who none of the other senators like, right, then it's oddly enough, it's either Cruz or Sanders, because neither one is popular in the Senate, as it turns out. To get more serious, there is a complication here, and that is you don't want a system of accountability that is so rigorous and so ruthless that one mistake means you're out forever, right? Because foreign policy is, in fact, sometimes hard. No administration gets everything right. No official in a serious position of responsibility is going to make the right call every single time. And you want people to be, not so cautious that they never take a chance, that they never, try something that they know might fail, because they think that they would be, driven out. So there has to be some forgiveness built into the system. If you performed pretty well, but you made some mistakes, you shouldn't be eliminated from future consideration for office. That said, I think we've swung way too far over on the other side, where basically people who are staffing administrations or putting together teams or whatever, what's the most important criterion that they have? It's not competence, it's loyalty, right? And loyalty is an important quality in politics, but it's not the only quality as well. And I wish we could, all I can do is try and point this out and say, if you keep letting the same people, run your foreign policy, you're going to keep getting the same foreign policy. And if you like that foreign policy, then you don't have a problem with it. If you think it has some shortcomings, you might want to try and find ways to open the circle up to a wider array of people and opinions, and maybe not use the same people. If they've been given 2 or 3 attempts to solve a problem and have failed each time, maybe it's time for them to step back and let somebody else do it. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.